picketing miners, police and a government minister join Sue McGregor as we look back on one of the most acrimonious industrial disputes in British history in the first of a new series of The Reunion.
March the 5th, 1984, 500 Yorkshire miners at Cortonwood Colliery near Barnsley walked out in an angry protest against the announced closure of their pit. It was the start of a long, bitter and sometimes violent struggle between the miners and their employers, the National Coal Board, backed by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government. The walkout was a defining moment in Britain's industrial relations history, ending as it did with the biggest defeat for the trades union movement since the General Strike of 1926. The conflict was played out daily on television screens and radio sets, but at first the eventual result seemed far from inevitable. There were divisions within the NCB and the Conservative government, and the NUM's own rules made a national ballot to strike difficult. And some miners in different unions went on working. The NUM strike was to last for a year and would plunge many miners' families into poverty and create deep divisions in what had been close-knit communities. It left a bitter taste, which lasts until this day.
Britain needs coal. Coal needs men.
Under Clement Attlee's post-war Labour government, the coal industry in Britain was nationalised. But the National Union of Mineworkers was a powerful force, and by January 1972, when mining wages had fallen behind, members called their first national strike in almost 50 years. They wanted a 43% pay rise. In February, the Saltley Coke Works in the West Midlands were forced to close after a full-scale picket with countrywide union support.
When the shop stewards procession arrived, it rapidly became obvious that there'd be no chance of getting more vehicles in and out today.
Victory in the so-called Battle of Saltley Gate turned the spotlight on the chairman of the Yorkshire NUM Executive Committee, Arthur Scargill.
We want assurances from the chairman of the gas board in writing that only permit holders from the NUM to distribute fuel to hospitals, schools and needy cases will go through these gates. And if the gas board here will do the same, there'll be no further problems.
Over the next 12 months, miners went on a work to rule. There wasn't enough coal being produced to keep the power stations running, and the government was forced to take drastic action.
The government has ordered severe cuts in electricity for industry and commerce. For many workers, it will mean a 3-day week and less pay.
The Prime Minister called a general election in February 1974 to decide who governs Britain.
What they want is to bring down the elected government. Not just this government, but any government.
Ted Heath lost his gamble. The new Labour government agreed a plan for coal with the Coal Board and the unions. In 1979, as another general election loomed, the opposition leader Margaret Thatcher made it clear that she would not allow any government she led to be held to ransom by the miners.
None of us wants to see our country torn apart. We've seen strikes called before agreements have ended. We've seen them used as a weapon of first resort, not as the last step after everything else has failed.
The first clashes came in 1981. The Conservative government threatened to ignore the plan for coal and close 23 pits. Half the country's miners went on strike, and the government, realising coal stocks were low, backed down.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Later in the year, Joe Gormley was replaced by a more strident NUM leader. Arthur Scargill was prepared to do battle in his own way.
We shall do all in our power to resist this closure programme, and we would urge all our members to continue to support union policy, to defend their pit and their jobs.
Well, with me round the table to remember the miners' strike of 84-85 are 5 people closely involved. Kenneth Clarke, who was then Health Minister and later became Secretary of State for Health and Education Secretary under Margaret Thatcher. Kim Howells, who worked at the NUM Pontypridd office during the strike and went on to be a Labour MP and a Foreign Office Minister. Barbara Jackson, who worked at the NCB office in Sheffield but joined the strike herself to support the miners. Mel Hepworth, who was a miner in Asken near Doncaster, who became an active flying picket. And Bill King, a chief inspector with Bedfordshire Police, who led police support units during the strike. Ken Clarke, let me start with you. Margaret Thatcher had her own brush, as we've heard, with the NUM earlier on, and she was very determined that this time the NUM wouldn't win. She thought, didn't she, that reason simply did not apply in the coal industry anymore?
No, I don't think it was a reason.
That's a direct quote from her.
Coal mine, well, she thought it wasn't being applied, probably, by Arthur Scargill and that wing of the NUM leadership. Coal mines have been closing throughout my lifetime. Most of the coal mines had closed before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister.
But why she thought reason didn't apply, I believe, is that she thought it was inefficiently run, the coal industry, and it was very expensive. It required a great deal of subsidy.
Well, it just lost a huge amount of money. No other country in Western Europe would have carried on driving up the energy prices for the rest of its economy by running redundant coal mines.
Kim Howells, you were then working with the National Union of Mineworkers. You came from South Wales. I know you started as a miner, but you were by then a white-collar person.
So I can't remember wearing a white collar to work mine, but I was the research officer of the South Wales miners, and we'd been on strike quite a lot since 1979 prior to the strike. So I got a lot of experience by March 1984 in organising pickets. We'd sent our delegates to all the coalfields in Britain to try to get support. Some of our guys came back from Nottingham. I don't know whether they were at Cotgrave, where Ken's constituents were, but they came back and I said, well, how did you get on in Nottingham? And they said, well, they were terrific. They were very courteous. They gave us everything except their vote.
Mel Hepworth, you were a miner at the age of 16.
That's right.
And you were, in your early 20s when the confrontation
happened? I was 20
happened?
at the time of the strike. I had my 21st birthday during the strike, actually on a picket line.
In what way would you say you were aware that this, or perhaps you weren't, that there was going to be a crunch in March 84?
The history of the miners has always been one of trade union militancy. It's always been one of collectivism. I think this is something that the Conservative Party were very much against, and Margaret Thatcher was determined to crush that. I think surely even Ken Clarke would have to admit that it was not about economics, it was about politics.
Let me ask Barbara Jackson, who's sitting next to me. You actually worked for the National Coal Board, Barbara, in Sheffield, but you were to go on strike yourself. Were your loyalties, therefore, with your bosses or with the miners?
Well, I worked as an administrator in a big National Coal Board office in Sheffield, and I was in the white-collar section of the NUM. And we thought the call to go out on strike applied to us, because without the mining industry, administrative jobs like mine wouldn't exist.
Bill King, were you aware before the strike was called that police would be likely to be involved in any dispute?
Yes. It was being talked about a lot in the service, though there was no special preparations. Crowd control methods had been introduced into the service about 75 with the introduction of shields for the very first time. And between 75 and 84, training was ramped up throughout the whole country.
Were you at all uneasy about this as a working class person yourself?
No.
It wasn't class war for you?
No, I could see that it was class war. I come from a very strong Labour family in Manchester, and it's interesting that we have never spoken about the miners once in the 30 years since between us.
Ken Clarke, was Ian McGregor brought in to head the National Coal Board as somebody who Margaret Thatcher knew would stand firm? He had a reputation as somebody who was quite tough.
Well, probably, as everybody agreeing round the table. It was plain as a pikestaff there was going to be a strike. And no doubt when appointing Ian McGregor, Margaret did have that in mind. There was no point in having someone as chairman who was going to immediately want to sort of back away and say, couldn't we just subsidise, put more millions into the coal industry for the next few years?
Did we not already establish that it wasn't about economics, that it was about politics?
It was about economics. It was about we could not afford to keep subsidising what was left of the coal industry. Arthur's demands in this strike were no coal mine should ever close unless it's fully worked out. The communist government of the Czechoslovakia would never have agreed to that.
Sorry, when you said that Arthur took over, Arthur was elected by the members, but when you said that Ian McGregor was appointed, you got that exactly right.
But surely when somebody's appointed as a chairman of a nationalised industry, they were appointed on a wider basis than just managing what could be a potential strike. Yeah. There is more to our life than just sheer economics. We're dealing with people here.
Kim Howells.
We'd suffered from Ian McGregor already because he'd cut back on steel production a lot. I mean, he'd sacked half the workforce, basically, literally half the workforce. And so we could see it coming from a long way off.
Mr. McGregor, are you frightened by the prospect of a strike if that's what happens in the coal industry?
I think it would be very, very sad. It would be a form of self-destruction.
The new coal board chief believed an overtime ban would soon turn into a full-blown strike. On March the 5th, 1984, there was the walkout by 500 miners in protest at reports of the closure of Cortonwood Colliery near Rotherham. The next week, 56,000 miners across Yorkshire went on strike. And later in the month, collieries in Scotland saw violence between working and striking miners.
This afternoon's violence at Bilston Glen was in contrast to the earlier, much more good-natured picketing as the morning shift arrived.
BBC industrial correspondent Nicholas Jones.
Tonight, all the Scottish coalfield is at a standstill.
On the 12th of April, the National Executive of the NUM made a crucial decision. There would be no national ballot on strike action. Instead, they'd leave the decision to local lodges.
Celebrating victory for Mr. Scargill. No to a national ballot, yes to a delegates' meeting.
With real confrontation becoming increasingly likely, Ian McGregor went directly to Mrs. Thatcher for support. She offered the full cooperation of the police to protect those miners who wanted to work.
Working miners are walking now in ones and twos to the entrance of the tunnel which leads into the colliery. A line of police in yellow anoraks is stretching down the road towards the village. Apparently these days the locals call this road Fluorescent Alley.
Mrs. Thatcher, on the BBC's Panorama programme, repeated her mantra that the miners' strike was nothing to do with the government.
This is a dispute between miners and miners. It's some of the miners who are trying to stop other miners going to work.
Scargill accuses McGregor of deplorable behaviour. He tells the miners, "You're being misled."
Ian McGregor went on ITV's TVI to appeal to miners to return to work.
We have in the United Kingdom an enormous endowment in our coal reserves. We can easily be the energy kings in Europe.
Arthur Scargill saw things differently.
There can be no settlement of this dispute until and unless Mr. McGregor withdraws his unilateral decision to butcher this industry by closing over 20 pits this year and axing 20,000 jobs as a prelude to axing around 70,000 jobs in the next 2 to 3 years.
Ken Clark, as we've heard, Margaret Thatcher at that time was saying in public that the government was not going to get involved in the dispute. But since then, of course, we know from cabinet papers that were released at the very beginning of this year, that in fact Margaret Thatcher was very, very involved from the beginning.
The new government in many areas was no longer just giving in to strike action, particularly violent strike action. It doesn't mean the government wasn't concerned.
As she did on Panorama, we heard her say, It's nothing to do with the government is not involved. Was it at the very best disingenuous? Because Mr. Clark, you must have known that she was actually directing Ian McGregor as to how he should behave.
Not intervening meant that Ian McGregor was not going to be ordered by the politicians to give in.
But we do know also that Arthur Scargill was right when he said over 70 pits were going to be closed, because we know from the cabinet papers that were published that is the number of pits that Ian McGregor had in mind. And he must have discussed that with the Prime Minister.
He must have had some idea of what rate he was going to have to continue closing. They've been closing at that rate for years. There was no future for most of these pits.
We never believed it for a moment, and we knew there were going to be very, very big closures, as there had been since the Second World War. It's a curious thing, really. There'd always been this gospel inside the Labour Party that the best thing you could do with an industry is nationalise it. And yet, if you'd gone back in history to the strikes in the Ronda in the first decade of the 20th century, you saw there that they were arguing that once the state owns an industry, then the state can use its full power to break a strike, to destroy a strike. And that's precisely what they did, because, of course, what they had at their command was the police force.
Bill King.
As soon as the mine strike started, the National Reporting Centre, New Scotland Yard, was implemented immediately. Every week a different chief constable was drafted in to run the thing, and we had been training logistically, tactics, strategy for a long time.
Mel Hepworth, how prepared were you to be a flying picket?
Well, I was prepared to stand up not only for my job but in defence of my community and for future generations. Ken Clark says it's a horrible place place to work. As a 16-year-old miner at the time, there's no one needs to remind me how horrible it is. But I do wish that those pits were open and that the future generations had a chance of at least having a job. I mean, we talked about the police, and the police were very well organised, I have to say that. They were organised in terms of military-style roadblocks. We talked about defensive equipment. It was actually offensive equipment. There were mounted police, there were dogs, there were the use of long truncheons, phone tapping of union officers.
Well, that's an allegation on your part.
Well, it is, but it's one that I'm prepared to make, and I've just made.
Barbara Jackson, were you a flying picket, or did you have one particular place?
No,
where you
I wasn't
picketed?
a flying picket. I picketed my particular office every morning for a year of the strike. And actually what Bill said about the police, he said, we were organised, we were prepared, but you're not there to be an arm of the government.
The general,
excuse me, I've not finished.
I beg your pardon.
The general public out there think that the police are there to fight crime, not to act like a militarised arm of the government,
But
which
they're
is
also
what
there,
you
Barbara,
do.
to protect people.
They're there to protect people, but they're not there to attack people. And you became a law unto yourselves.
I don't agree with any of that. I think the police are there in a democratic society to uphold the law. The law was that you're allowed to peacefully picket and persuade people to work or not at your own place of work and nowhere else.
Laws are open to different interpretations, and Kim Howells, you'll remember that the NUM had this Rule 41 and Rule 43. One of those rules said you couldn't go on a mass strike without a national ballot, and the other one said it was perfectly legal for local branches to go on strike, but they had to have a ballot. And this led to an awful lot of bad feeling and muddle.
But this wasn't cooked up by Arthur Scargill. This was cooked up by Joe Gormley, his predecessor. The problem, and why not having a national ballot was a monkey on our back the whole time, was that it was being represented by the national leadership as a national strike, but the public didn't perceive it as a national strike because there hadn't been a national ballot.
Mel Hepworth, were you, as a striking miner, totally supportive of Arthur Scargill?
Yes.
Why?
He was the democratically elected leader of the miners. I'll just say that he was elected by over 70% of the NUM membership.
Ken Clark.
Arthur and the triumvirate ran it. Their stipulation was that all closures should now end unless and until a coal mine was worked out. And this appalling standoff took place. And the reason it got so violent was this mass intimidation. Flying pickets, which had come in the 70s, was the use not of a few people standing at the gate, explaining the dispute, asking people not to break the strike. It was howling mobs of hundreds of people who were there in order to intimidate people who wanted to work from going in.
I can remember at Blythedale, Silver, particularly Hatfield, Maine, the sky would go dark with stones, bricks, pieces of wood as we came under fire behind the shields.
Sue, I'm really surprised that Bill's using that term, the air was black with missiles, because that's what happened when the 95 miners who were arrested at Orgreave, when the first 15 of them came to trial in Sheffield Crown Court, and part of the evidence submitted by the police was that the air was black with missiles, and that trial collapsed through lack of evidence, and the rest of the miners weren't brought to trial. And so as Ken got to be very careful about emotive words being used about howling mobs, because at the end of the day we're talking about people who were driven to go on strike, who were frustrated about the police tactics and had got no way of demonstrating their opposition to what was going on.
Police tactics used were perfectly lawful and upheld at several cases in the High Court in 1984.
Did you see the sky go black with missiles?
Yes, I did, particularly at Hatfield, Maine, in those 2 particular days in November. This wasn't a tiny few pickets stood quietly at the side of the police force. This was huge numbers of people, and they were quite determined to close the pit. And I was equally determined that I and my men would do what we were being paid properly to do.
They had roadblocks that turned people away. I can remember getting stopped at Blythe Roundabout, which is about 12 miles from Doncaster, quite often getting stopped by police from Surrey, Sussex, Kent and London, and asked where I was going. I was about 12 miles from home. They were about 150 miles from home.
It would be true to say, Mel, that to miners died on the picket line, one of them at Ollerton Colliery. Yes. Were you around at the time?
I was, yes. Someone had a CB radio back in those days, and we heard on the CB radio that someone had been killed.
It was a fight. The villagers
you weren't there, as you say yourself, Ken.
Carried on. I've heard a lot about it. It was murder quite
I've heard a lot about many things.
It was a death, tragic death, very near where I live.
By a flying brick, and it was never
the Yorkshire pickets came in all the
happened.
time to the northern part of the county. They were from Kent, in my part of the world, and they came in, and unfortunately the bad blood between the locals meant that some of the youths carried on fighting each other when the picketing was over, and sadly, tragically, a young man got killed.
Okay, so we've established that there were some miners on strike in Nottinghamshire. Thank you for mentioning Kent, because we also need to make it clear that it's not about north-south either. The Kent miners were heroic to the end. I'm surprised too many Kent miners made it to Nottinghamshire, because we're back to the roadblocks again, where actually they were stopped at the Dartford Tunnel.
Was there, Ken Clark, a plan B?
I don't think so. We were not given the opportunity to say the demand was an undertaking no closures, which was absurd. We were still investing in new coal mines, trying to give the industry a future, but there was no attempt to negotiate from the other side. They assumed that what would happen was what had happened in 1974, when the Heath government had actually been removed from office by a similar strike.
At Orgreave Steelworks in South Yorkshire on the 29th of May 1984, according to Home Office figures, 6,500 pickets faced 2,500 police.
We've been listening to Mr. Scargill now for something like 12 weeks, and he never seems to say anything different.
Tony Clements was the Assistant Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police.
Our officers were being injured. That was the time for me to order people to go in with shields.
The miners' leader saw it differently.
We've seen truncheons and staves in action. We've seen mounted police officers charging into our ranks throughout the morning, and I'm sure that if your cameras had been directed properly, you would have seen the same.
A few hundred yards short of the entrance, where the mass of pickets was concentrated yesterday, the miners' president stopped and stood his ground.
The next day, as he led a group of supporters towards the picket line, Scargill was arrested.
I said move. I'm saying said move.
No way!
Listen,
no way!
You're blocking the footpath. Right, arrest him, then he's under arrest.
By far the worst violence so far occurred at Orgreave 2 weeks later, on June the 18th. The BBC's Bob Sinkinson provided a vivid running commentary.
And the mounted police are going in again. I'm standing behind a line of 5 officers. My God. It is quite frightening. These missiles just come from nowhere. You just can't see them because they're being thrown right into the sun.
All I say is if you're using your gun, do not hit the head. Not hit the head, over.
This is the worst I've ever seen it.
Were you frightened?
Yes, very.
What was the general atmosphere?
Violent.
They're brandishing truncheons, and in behind them go the mounted police officers, again in an attempt to break up the pickets.
Well, Bill King, that was obviously quite a dramatic memory for everybody. It was probably the most vivid confrontation of the entire mining dispute of 84,
yes,
85.
There were 5,000 on either side on the day, I think. 5,000 police and 5,000 pickets.
You weren't there yourself?
I wasn't. I was on duty nearby another pit, but I was there in that area on the day. For myself, it was a turning point. Had the police been overwhelmed at Orgreave, then I think it would have had a decisive effect.
There's a lot of nonsense talked about Orgreave, actually, that somehow it was this vital target. Saltley Gates had worked because the NUM had reached out and embraced the other trade unions, and they'd come from Birmingham and everywhere in there. There was a tremendous sense of union solidarity in 74. The reverse happened in 1984, and it seemed to us that Orgreave was absolute madness, which it was. Those tactics by that time were a waste of time. And all it resulted in was hundreds of our boys coming back on coaches, battered.
Ken Clark.
Had Orgreave actually fallen, as it were, then I think we could have been in very big trouble. But we'd have to work out whether you could keep the power going, keep the lights on. And almost certainly there'd be more violent attacks on other places if Orgreave had fallen.
But as we now know from the Cabinet papers published 30 years later, Margaret Thatcher did consider bringing in the army.
Well, nobody wanted to bring in the army. Nobody wanted to use the police in this way. It was all utterly absurd. absurd. It was a belief that so long as you could get thousands of people to storm a place with sufficient force, you could oblige the government to give in to your demand.
Barbara Jackson, from your great intake of breath that I heard there, you were convinced that the government was organising that sort of confrontation deliberately.
Yeah, it was well known about Nicholas Ridley had laid down a paper.
Conservative minister.
Yeah, in the late 70s about if the Tory government came to power to stamp their authority on the country, they wanted to take on a major trade union and beat that trade union. But Orgreave, the BBC has a part to play in how the general public perceived Orgreave, because it wasn't the miners who charged the police on the 18th of June. It was the police that opened ranks and then the horses came out. But on that day's news, the footage had got reversed, so it was shown that the miners were charging.
I think the BBC did say later that this was an accident.
Can I ask what the NUM thought they were doing when they bussed in 5,000 young men to Orgreave? I mean, was this just to explain the nature of the dispute? Was this going to be lawful, peaceful picketing? In my opinion, it must have been quite obvious to everybody getting on the bus that there was going to be another punch-up.
If you look at the pictures of the time, it was in summer and the miners are dressed in T-shirts, trainers and jeans. They hadn't got riot gear, they hadn't got horses, they hadn't got dogs. The pickets were there to be effective.
Just to say that I was at Orgreave on several occasions, and it will go down in history because it's one of the times where we do have footage. There's lots in the archives to show the tactics of the police.
You had this confrontation, which was about absolutely no closures, and we knew that was never going to make any sense. It was then constantly fed like a furnace by statements that were made. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, described us as the enemy within. She just won the Falklands War. The fascist generals who ran the Argentinian army were the enemy without. We, who'd sustained this country through 2 world wars and God knows what else, was suddenly the enemy within because we were fighting for our own jobs. They were really hurt.
An unfortunate remark in the circumstances.
In a way, it wasn't aimed at the entire mining community, though that's how it was interpreted. This kind of organised sort of intimidation and violence to try to achieve an unachievable aim, I think that's what was being criticised. And the longer it went on, it dragged on and on and on and on. So as always happens in conflict situations, unfortunately, both sides begin to get ever more heated and determined, and it just did become attrition.
One end of the spectrum are the terrorist gangs within our borders and the terrorist states which finance and arm them. At the other are the hard left, operating inside our system, conspiring to use union power and the apparatus of local government to break, defy and subvert the law. We must never give in to the oldest and least democratic trick of all, the coercion of the many by the ruthless manipulating few.
If 1/10 of the energy that's been devoted over the past months to attacking this union had been devoted to attacking McGregor, they would have saved their jobs as well.
But at the Trades Union Congress in the autumn, Arthur Scargill maintained that there was no such thing as an uneconomic pit, only a pit that lacked investment. It was a bravura performance.
Ian McGregor's objective is a simple one. It's not merely to inflict a defeat on the National Union of Mineworkers or to close down 70 of our pits with the resulting loss of 70,000 jobs. His policy, which is being earmarked by this government, is to defeat you as a trade union movement, because our fight is your fight.
A taxi driver has been killed taking a miner to work in South Wales.
Then, on the 30th of November, came the shocking news of the death of a taxi driver.
The victim was David Wilkie, hired by the coal board to take 2 miners to the Merthyr Vale colliery.
Kim Howells, then a South Wales NUM official, gave the union's response.
I think it was inevitable that some kind of tragedy would occur because of the way in which the coalfield has been wound up over the past 2 or 3 weeks.
But that's no justification for this
I'm
morning.
not trying to justify it for 1 minute. It's a great tragedy and one which I'm sure everyone in South Wales feels tremendous sorrow for the man and for his family, and I think everyone in this office has has been knocked flat by it, really.
Kim Hulls, that was you 30 years ago. Can you remind us exactly what happened, how David Wilkie died?
Well, there was one man who'd gone back to work at Merthyr Vale Colliery, and a taxi firm had been hired by the coal board to take this miner to Merthyr Vale Colliery, and some young striking miners pushed a concrete block off a bridge, and it went straight through the windscreen and it killed David Wilkie. It was a terrible occasion. His family were in a pretty desperate state afterwards, as you can imagine. And I'm afraid it alienated a lot of the public who previously had been pretty solidly behind us. We noticed in that November, that terrible November, that the mood and the atmosphere grew much, much darker.
And you've admitted that you rushed into the office and destroyed certain documents that might be, quotes, incriminating about picketing tactics.
Well, we'd had telephone logs of everybody, virtually everybody in southern Britain who'd ever phoned up to offer help for the miners, and I wasn't about to let that land in the hand of Mrs. Thatcher's government.
So what did you do?
So I destroyed it.
Where did you put them?
I shredded them.
Do you regret that at all now?
Well, it would have been a great source for historians, I think, to see who was on the side of the miners and who wasn't.
Barbara Jackson.
Each death in a situation like that is a complete tragedy, as was the death of David Jones at Ollerton Pit. And his father and mother grieve today about you losing that 20-year-old boy, about the death of Joe Green, a striking miner, I think out at Ferrybridge Power Station. Right. He got swept under the wheels of a lorry. So each and every one of those deaths is a tragedy to be regretted.
You were a member of a group called Sheffield Women Against Pit Closures. Did you find that the mining wives, if you like, were beginning to organise themselves in terms of raising money, distributing food, that sort of thing by now?
Yeah, very early on in the strike, the women came forward as a force in their own right. And I can say you can't stay out on strike for a year without the support of your family. There's no way emotionally and physically that you can sustain that. We organised in South Yorkshire to collect money, and we distributed in £100 at a time to various women's groups that they needed baby clothes and baby food and even basic things like shampoo and sanitary items. And it was desperate going through the cold winter as well.
Sue, what's quite interesting, we had a new baby in the April of the strike. And the people who were organising, women mainly, were organising the local miners' support committee. They heard that my wife was a vegetarian. And so anything that, all the food cans that came in from abroad that nobody could recognise by the label on the outside of the can ended up in our house. It was assumed that it was some strange kind of Polish vegetable or something that nobody knew about.
I remember myself getting some food parcel, and the food came from Russia, and I didn't have the language skills to read the label on the tin, but I was sure as hell hungry enough to open the tin and eat the food. To this day, I don't know.
Bill King.
I would like to say that on this subject, the saddest week for me in the miners was the week of 13th of December. It was my 40th birthday. 2 weeks before Christmas, we were detached to a village. There was snow on the ground and the soup kitchens, the shortage of money, it was staring you in the face on every street.
A little before that, Kim Hulls, and you would remember this, 2 miners actually went to the High Court to get the strike declared illegal because Arthur Scargill hadn't called a national ballot. And the court found in favour of the 2 miners, and Arthur Scargill was fined £1,000 and the NUM was fined £200,000. But the money somehow wasn't there, was it?
That was later on in the strike. We'd already had our funds sequestrated, as it was called, in the summer. We tried to, in secret, to get the funds out of the building and get out of our banks. But it had all been grabbed already. We were kind of the victims of this new electronic age. And we spent the rest of the strike, trying to smuggle funds around the place. It was real cloak and dagger stuff. I mean, looking back on it, people got pinned down by lots of different little tactics that we used rather than one big crushing defeat.
The daily figures for the numbers of miners at work were pored over by the coal board. Once published, they were routinely disputed by the NUM, But it was clear that the drift back was reaching a crucial point.
As another 1,300 miners changed their minds and clocked on for work, the psychological 50% mark was crossed.
On the 3rd of March 1985, the inevitable announcement finally came.
The coal strike is over. The Mineworkers Union is telling the men to go back to work on Tuesday.
At just after 7 this morning, the last pit in the Rhondda Valley went back to work. The men marched back defiantly behind the Mardy and Tylerstown brass band and their lodge banners.
Whatever they may have won or lost in the past 12 months, they were determined to keep their pride. Tonight, the majority of miners, 85%, are said to be back at work.
Mardy will never see anything like this again. 600 men marching in column, miners' wives' support groups, nurses from the Rhondda Hospital, and the whole village community turning out on the pavements to applaud their men back to work.
Kim Howells, what's your most vivid memory now, looking back after 30 years of that time?
Well, the end of the strike remains a vivid image in my own mind. I went up with our new son. He was born in the April of the strike, and with my daughter, Seren, and with hundreds of other people, we marched up this remote, windswept road to Mardy Colliery. And I remember my friend Ivor England playing the trombone in the band that marched everybody back to work. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. It's impossible, really, to describe the emotional impact of it.
Barbara, you were in Sheffield.
Yeah. It was so emotional. I can hardly bear to think about it. Our experience wasn't going back to work behind a brass band with banners flying and hundreds of people lining the street clapping us. Our experience was 9 of us meeting together at 8:30 and walking in together, and there was nobody to witness that. And then we were immediately hived off as individuals and had our futures discussed. They said that I would be on probation for 3 months and I could go home and think about it for 24 hours. And I just skipped out of the building thinking, God, I'm released again. So I just thought, I don't want to go back. I didn't want to return to that atmosphere. I wasn't feeling brave enough and strong enough to go and work back with those people who'd, crossed the picket line for a year.
So you didn't?
No, I didn't go back. No, it didn't take me long to think about it.
The battle lasted a year. It was victory for the government and defeat for the unions. But it wasn't necessarily a victory for Mrs Thatcher, or was it?
No, I think Margaret always polarised opinion. Once you get an incident like this, 12 months of bitter social conflict with different reactions in different parts of the country, well, you're polarising opinion even more. The violence of the action polarised opinion. But you've got to put it in context. I mean, we're all reminiscing round here. The industrial disputes of this kind were the daily way of life of politicians throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. I mean, I had never expected as a youngish politician then that I'd live through a period of struggle of this kind in the United Kingdom. It was a throwback to the kind of thing customary on some continental European countries before the war.
Barbara Jackson, you don't see it like that?
No, I mean, strikes are the last resort. People don't go out on strike easily. I didn't go out on strike easily. But you sometimes get pushed into a corner where you feel that you've not got a say in your working life.
Mel Hepworth, would you sit down now and talk to somebody who you might call a scab?
I wouldn't, no, not personally. I mean, I would.
You still couldn't after 30 years?
No. I think something that Ken said about the throwback to continental-style strikes, I think we have to be very careful. We're suggesting that strikes are alien to British culture, and I think if we look back to the working class history of people in this country, we'll find that it's a very long and very proud one. The Luddites, the suffragettes, the Tolpuddle martyrs, the Chartists. To see strikes as alien and to see something overseas is very convenient for the Tories.
Bill King.
At the start of the dispute, I think the government of the day set the police force a really difficult situation. There was 43 separate police forces for the first time in history. Logistically, operationally, they're required to work together. And looking back on it, I think the police service, with some aberrations, did very well.
Barbara.
Witnessing Francis Moat's reaction in Parliament a month ago when he was asked formally by the Labour Party to apologise about the strike, and he said there'll be no apology. But for me, I didn't live in a small pit village. Living in a large city, after the strike was over, there were lots of opportunities for me. There were transport links and stuff like that. For the women in the pit villages, a lot of them didn't want the strike to end because they knew then that unless they put up a tremendous fight, that their lives would shrink.
Ken Clark, I think there are still 3 working mines, biggish ones, left in the United Kingdom.
Yes, they're modern ones. Yes,
is that a matter of regret for you, coming from a mining family as you do?
Not at all. I say every miner I ever knew didn't want his son to go down the pit.
He didn't want his son to be unemployed either.
Unless you had a sort of really a modern, properly run mine. I still know a lot of miners. I have constituents who are retired miners. Practically all of them have got chest complaints. Industrial relations today are 10 times better than they were in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Yes, we've got rid of the militants. People do now. I remember as a student doing factory jobs, the hatred of sections of the workforce for the managers with whom they were working. We're living in a modern...
There is no industry, it's gone.
This romanticising of the miners' strike is living in a long-lost world that never really existed.
We never romanticise it.
Kim Howells.
For me, it was a year in which there was enormous courage shown. There was incredible things done. Women's support groups who fed 1,000 families for a year. But, in the November of the strike, one of the very great miners' leaders, Will Painter, he died in that winter. And he said to me not long before he died how worried he was about the conduct of the strike. And he said to me, look, it's easy enough to get men out on strike when they've got a justifiable objective. But it takes a lion to get men back to work when you know that you're not going to win anymore.
I always say we were defeated industrially, but we weren't ultimately defeated in our spirit. For me personally, the weight of the industrial defeat weighed very, very heavily on me.
And still does.
And still does, yeah.
Barbara Jackson, Kim Howells, Mel Hepworth, Bill King and Ken Clark. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Thank you.